Hi, everybody, and good morning. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for CFP Board's Certificant Connection webinar. I'm Kevin Keller, CFP Board's CEO. Today, we are broadcasting from CFP Board's offices in Washington, D.C., and our 2019 Chair of the Board, Susan John, is in her office in Wolfboro, New Hampshire. Today's webinar will focus on an update about the Independent Task Force on Enforcement that the Board of Directors commissioned back in July. After that update, we will turn to answering your questions. So please contribute your questions and thoughts with us today during today's program. Before we get into our presentation, let me go over a few housekeeping items. If you run into issues with the audio for this presentation, or if it seems like the slides are out of sync, refresh your webinar console. There is a Q&A function on your screen that you can use to submit questions to us at any time during the program. We will address as many questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the program. And if we don't get to your question today during the broadcast, CFP Board will follow up to provide you with an answer. As I said earlier, with me here this morning is Susan John, the 2019 Chair of the Board of Directors. Susan, why don't we just jump right in and share with us some of the background on the task force.
Thanks, Kevin. This past July, the Board of Directors commissioned an independent task force on enforcement. The task force was charged with examining our enforcement practices and making actionable recommendations to strengthen and modernize them. They were asked to look at the full enforcement process, from background checks through investigations and hearings to the way we publicize outcomes and the information that we share on our website listings. And the task force was asked to balance the need to be thorough with the desire to be prompt in taking action, with a goal of presenting recommendations to the board at its meeting this past November. We couldn't have had a better person leading this effort. The chair of the task force is Denise Voigt Crawford. Denny is a securities consultant who served 17 years as the Texas Securities Commissioner. She's currently one of 4 public members on our board of directors. As a 501c3 professional body, our bylaws state that we should have at least 2 public members at any one time, but we believe that having a greater number is essential to ensuring that public interests are represented in our governance and the work of the CFP Board. In addition, our certification program is accredited by NCCA, the National Commission on Certifying Agencies, and one of the standards states that the board of a certification body should include at least 1 public member that represents the public or a non-employee consumer interest. Compliance with NCCA standards is essential to maintaining our accreditation and ensuring the value and relevance of our certification program. The board gave Denny authority to assemble and conduct this task force with full independence. We were very pleased with the impressive individuals that she pulled together for the task force, all of whom bring experience, integrity, and forward-thinking approaches for this important task. When we announced the task force, we noted that we would be sharing its recommendations publicly. And we made good on that promise yesterday with the publication of the task force complete report of findings and recommendations. You can find the report on our website, cfp.net. I want to commend the task force members for their diligence in conducting their examination. The task force delivered their preliminary report as promised in time for CFP Board's November Board of Directors meeting. We had a very thorough discussion with task force members, and we requested some points of clarification. The final report was delivered to us on December 17th, and it is robust and comprehensive. The board has read the report thoroughly, and we take its recommendations very seriously. We are committed to strengthening CFP Board's enforcement of the code and standards to benefit all Americans and to reinforce the confidence and security people gain from working with a CFP professional. The task force provided their findings and recommendations organized in 4 main categories. The first section addresses ways in which CFP Board's governance structure may impact our enforcement program. The second section looks at ways to enhance our existing enterprise risk management system, which will be updated and overseen at the level of the Board of Directors. A third section outlines ways that our work to publicize the CFP mark and our public mission can be better aligned with a strong enforcement program. And finally, the fourth section provides suggestions for modifying our enforcement program to ensure that CFP professionals are held to an appropriate level of compliance with CFP Board's Code of Ethics and Standards of Conduct. As many of you know, one of our 4 strategic priorities is to assure accountability by holding CFP professionals to rigorous standards. Enforcement of our new code and standards, which became effective October 1st, 2019, is consistent with this intent. Kevin, why don't you share the board's preliminary response to the task force report?
Indeed, Susan, I think maybe before we get into that preliminary response, why don't we talk a little bit about our current enforcement program? CFP Board has a multifaceted approach to vetting individuals before they become certified. We have processes in place to make sure people satisfy each of the CFP certification requirements. And quite frankly, many people don't make it through those requirements and ultimately become certified. As anybody who's certified knows, we refer to the requirements as the 4 E's, the first of which is education. Each year, we have thousands of people who start our education program but never complete them. With the exam, about 38% of the candidates fail the exam and never become certified. With experience, upwards of 500 people each year fall out of the 5-year time frame for completing the experience requirement. And the ethics requirement involves an exhaustive background check to determine whether the candidate's prior conduct is consistent with our ethical and fitness standards. Candidates for CFP certification who have engaged in conduct that may reflect adversely upon the profession or the CFP marks are required to demonstrate their fitness for CFP certification. Here you can see a list of conduct deemed unacceptable from our fitness standards for candidates and individual requirements for reinstatement. If we find any of these matters when conducting a background check for a candidate, again, that's somebody who is not yet certified, they are not allowed to become certified. Individuals who do not meet our ethical requirements are denied certification. And if this type of conduct takes place after someone becomes certified, our disciplinary rules call for an automatic interim suspension of CFP certification. Once certified, a CFP professional is required to comply with CFP Board's code and standards and must complete regular ethics attestations. Susan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, here you can see the questions that are on the current ethics declaration form, which include indicating whether the individual has been subject of a felony conviction, professional license suspension or revocation, civil lawsuits related to professional activities, and other incidents that may relate to violation of CFP Board's code and standards. If someone answers yes to any of the questions, CFP Board requires a written statement and will follow up for more information. Our enforcement program has historically relied heavily on this type of self-disclosure to identify issues that may require a disciplinary investigation. Our disciplinary rules and procedures were developed to define a clearly defined process intended to be fair to CFP professionals whose conduct comes under scrutiny and credible to the public. We take seriously our obligation to vet the individuals seeking to become CFP professionals and to address questionable conduct after individuals attain their CFP certification. CFP Board has conducted hundreds of investigations each year and has issued more than 1,000 public sanctions for noncompliance with its code and standards. Now let me tell you some of the things that we've done to strengthen that program in the next months. In mid-2019, CFP Board introduced enhancements to its enforcement program in response to important issues that were raised publicly, many of which the task force addressed in its report. A primary issue has been the reliance on CFP professionals' self-reporting events that would trigger an investigation. To address this concern and to strengthen the enforcement of its code and standards, CFP Board has taken several preliminary actions. First, we no longer rely primarily on CFP individuals to disclose matters to CFP Board. We continue to require CFP professionals to complete an ethics declaration as part of that renewal process, and we will be updating, based on the form that we showed you on the previous slide, what additional questions will be added to that. But now we're supplementing our review of that self-disclosed information with an annual background check, including reviews of FINRA's broker check and the SEC's Investment Advisor Public Disclosure Database with other publicly available information. Our new code and standards also require CFP professionals to make ongoing disclosures of an expanded category of information. This includes things such as being the subject of a finding of fraud, theft, misrepresentation, or other dishonest conduct in a regulatory action or civil action. Excuse me. Really, excuse me. Time frame for making those disclosures to CFP Board is 30 calendar days.
Susan, would you like me to just jump in here with you?
If you wouldn't mind, Kevin, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. We now provide consumers with access to broker check and IAPD on the listings of current and former CFP professionals on our websites. We will continue to disclose CFP Board specific disciplinary history for the certificant, but we inform consumers that additional disclosure information, if any, is available at FINRA and the SEC. CFP Board staff is also continuously reviewing broker check records for existing CFP professionals, and we will continue to monitor and follow up on regulatory actions by the federal government and self-regulatory agencies if CFP professionals are named.
I think I'm okay to continue, Kevin.
All right. Well, you let me know, and I'll hop back in if you need me to.
Thank you. Thank you. So what do we do next? The task force concluded that there are opportunities to enhance CFP Board's governance, organizational structure, and processes. And while the board disagrees with some of the assertions and characterizations made in the report, and will continue to address the full range of recommendations made by the task force. The board already has committed to making a number of reforms to improving our enforcement program for the benefit of the public. The board's preliminary response to the task force report outlines 5 commitments from the board. First, we have committed to retain individuals with governance expertise to evaluate CFP Board's governance structure, including with respect to Board of Director composition and board oversight of the enforcement of CFP Board's code and standards. Second, the board has committed to define in written policies the specific enforcement outcomes that the Board of Directors expect CFP Board staff to achieve and to monitor rigorously the CEO's performance against those expectations. Third, the board is committed to placing greater priority on our enterprise risk, which will now be subject to a board committee's oversight. Enforcement and public awareness activities, including the lexmegaplan.org website, will be addressed in the Enterprise Risk Program. Fourth, the board has committed to require annual ethics attestations and improve the background checks on all CFP professionals. That includes access to and review of publicly available information according to the expanded due diligence process described in the above reforms. And finally, the board is committed to strengthen the sanction for failing to self-report information to CFP Board. CFP Board will form a commission in 2020 to review and develop recommendations for revision to the existing fitness sanctions and standards and sanction guidelines, and this will be part of the commission's mandate. CFP Board will invite public comment on any proposed changes to these fitness standards and sanction guidelines. As I mentioned, this is the board's preliminary plan of action. The board is committed to ensuring that CFP Board takes appropriate and proactive steps to identify misconduct and to enforce its code and standards. The task force report includes a broad range of recommendations that will require further deliberations to fully analyze their implications. It is important to note the CFP Board is a professional body that issues a voluntary certification. The board believes that some actions recommended by the task force are more properly reserved for a government regulator or a government-authorized SRO. Thus, the board does not intend for CFP Board's enforcement program to include conducting desk audits, other periodic audits, on-site examinations, random sampling or inspection of CFP professionals, or sanctioning a CFP professional for a CFP professional's firm's refusal to provide documents and information to CFP Board. This could be inferred by reading recommendation number 10A of the task force report. However, the board will form a commission in 2020 to consider revision to the existing fitness standards and sanction guidelines, which will include consultations with all stakeholders, including firms, about cooperation with CFP Board's investigations with proposed changes subject to a public comment period. The board is firmly committed to strengthening CFP Board's enforcement program for its code and standards and greatly appreciates the work done by the task force to help us identify specific actions designed to achieve that goal. Before making its final decisions, the board will continue to thoroughly digest, discuss, and deliberate the task force's additional recommendations as well as the potential implication of their implementation. We recognize and anticipate that some changes may require additional public comment. We are committed to making information about continued enhancements to CFP Board's enforcement of its code and standards public as it becomes available. I want to express my gratitude to our task force for their diligence and hard work, and to our board for the extraordinary amount of time it's taken us to review the task force recommendations. This process was an essential step that will help the board strengthen CFP Board's enforcement program, which will benefit all Americans and reinforce the confidence and security that comes from working with a CFP professional. While CFP Board continues to evaluate the report and the task force recommendations and otherwise examines its enforcement activities, I want to assure everyone that we'll be guided by our mission of benefiting the public by granting CFP certification and upholding it as the recognized standard of excellence for competent and ethical personal financial planning.
Susan, I want to first of all thank you, especially with the bad cold. So thank you for soldiering through this morning. And I would like to add my thanks to the task force and to the board for tackling these important issues. I appreciated the note by our task force chair, Denny Crawford, about their discussions with members of the board and the CFP staff, which revealed a strong commitment to protecting the public. All of us at CFP Board are committed to strengthening our enforcement program and doing right by our mission to benefit the public. And now let's turn to the Q&A portion. We have a number of questions that have come in, and I see one person asked before we get started, where is the report available? The report is available from our homepage. That's cfp.net, and from the press release. So link right to the press release, and you'll see the links to the report and our response to that. Let's jump in with the first question. The first question, when will the board release its final decisions on the task force's report and recommendations, Susan?
Well, you know, many of the recommendations require further discussion at the board level, and some may give rise to the need for a public comment process. We're not really in a position to provide an update on specific timing yet. We'll make additional information public as it becomes available.
Great, thank you. In its response, the board outlined 5 commitments it plans to take in response to the task force's recommendations. When do you plan on implementing them? Will those commitments change based on the board's continued review of the task force's recommendations?
Well, the board is fully committed to strengthening CFP Board's enforcement program and following through on our commitments to the public. Given the time of year, the board anticipates that planning and implementation for many of these commitments will begin in 2020. For instance, we said that we would create the commission to review fitness standards and sanction guidelines in 2020. And some of these reforms have already been underway.
Great. The board mentioned in its response that it is still deliberating. Again, this is a kind of a common theme here. Could you be more specific?
Well, once you've read the report, I personally read the report at least a dozen times, you'll understand that it really is robust and comprehensive, and many of these recommendations just really require further deliberation to fully analyze their implications. Given that the board is still in the process of discussing and deliberating the report on its final decisions and recommendations, we're really not able to be more specific at this time. But I will tell you that the board is absolutely committed to taking the time and resources required to get this right.
Susan, you mentioned 2 actions that CFP Board will not take in response to the task force's recommendations. would you, the question is, what is your rationale for not following those recommendations?
Well, CFP Board is a professional body that issues a voluntary certification. And some of the actions recommended by the task force are more properly reserved for a government regulator or an SRO than a professional body. And we had no discussions about entering into that area at this time. We're concerned primarily with enforcing our standards.
Great, thank you. Susan, one of the questions that came in was about shifting resources from the public awareness campaign to enforcement, and what were we doing there? And I'll take that just to address that question. CFP Board, with the implementation of the things that we've begun doing, that we've reported here, has incurred additional expense. But as the board begins its refresh of its strategy and its evaluation of the implications of the recommendations in the task force's report, obviously part of that will be a long-range financial plan. And so as the board begins its strategy refresh in 2020 and beyond, it will be evaluating what the cost of these additional requirements will be and how best to fund those. The final point I would make on this topic is the fact that the board has, at least to date, felt that public awareness and enforcement were both important components of the work of CFP Board. But again, that will be taken up in the strategy refresh as we go into the new year. Another question that has come in, could there be, Susan, other specific actions you will not take after making the final decisions?
Well, given that the board is still in the process of discussing and deliberating the task force report before making final decisions on its recommendations, I can't really speculate on future decisions. We've also made a commitment to hire some consultants to help us through the recommendations, particularly with regards to governance and structure. And any of those types of recommendations would, of course, require a public comment period. So more than that just can't be said at the present time.
Thank you, Susan. Question has come in, when in 2020 will the Commission to review CFP Board's fitness standards and sanction guidelines be formed, and who will staff it? I'll take that. We anticipate that the Commission will be formed in 2020. We'll have more information to share publicly in the new year. But I think just to give context to this, as many people know, we've recently updated our code and standards, and that was essentially the first part of a three-part process. So we have new code and standards effective October 1 of 2019, enforced June 30th of 2020. The second piece is the disciplinary and appeals rules. Those have been updated. There may be implications from the recommendations that are included in the task force's report that require additional changes here. And then the third component of those changes would be the fitness standards and sanction guidelines. So a large body of work. And the thinking is that ultimately these would all be combined into one book, one document, so that a CFP professional knows what the code and standards are, they know what the rules are, and they know what the sanction guidelines or the fitness standards are in order to become certified and to maintain CFP certification. Next question. This one's is CFP Board at fault for relying on self-reported data from CFP professionals in the first place, given its obligation to benefit the public? Why did CFP Board rely on self-disclosure alone? And given past challenges, is there still reliance on self-disclosure at all? And I would say that many professional organizations and established professions rely on self-disclosure. Self-disclosure remains important because some of the databases that collect publicly available information have gaps in their coverage. Self-disclosure helps to address some of those gaps. I would say we are no longer relying on self-disclosure once somebody has become certified. Susan, this next question is for you, and it's about the continued work of the task force. Will you continue to work with the task force when considering implementing their recommendations?
Well, we thank the task force members for volunteering their time on top of their full-time employment or being engaged in other activities. But the work of the task force is complete, and as such, the task force has disbanded. We'd not presume to impose on their time any further. We appreciate the opportunity we had to discuss with them in detail their preliminary findings so that we could have a full appreciation of why they made the recommendations that they did.
Thank you, Susan. Another question, I'll take this one. Can the board monitor state regulatory actions regarding CFP professionals as a source of possible enforcement actions? And the answer is yes, and it is part of our review currently and will be as we go forward. So thank you for that. How does CFP Board feel about the media coverage it received about the enforcement program? I'll take that as we appreciate the attention that the media has placed on CFP Board, given that there are over 200 financial designations in FINRA's website, many of which may not even have a code of standards. To us, this means there is value in CFP certification for the public, for financial advisors and the firms with which they're affiliated, which inspires us to continually improve our competency and ethical standards as well as the enforcement program. Next question. Given your reliance on the task force to evaluate your enforcement process, are you confident in your ability to enforce the new code and standards come this June? And I would answer that question, yes. CFP Board is expanding its enforcement efforts to look back historically at those who have had a disclosure event and to look forward by creating systems that will enable CFP Board to obtain contemporaneous information about CFP professionals that suggest a violation of our code and standards. Next question. Prior to the formation of the task force, how did CFP Board's Board of Directors oversee the enforcement process? And how will that change in 2020? The Board of Directors acts in an oversight role with respect to not just enforcement, but all of CFP Board's activities. The report concludes that the Board should expand its role in that area, and the response addresses some of the steps that the board has already said that it's prepared to take. But there are several, there are a number of things that the board has done all along, and the implicit, I think, in the question is maybe, that the board was not overseeing it. First of all, to say more, the board has always, the appeals function has always been a function of the board of directors, and so the board is directly involved in hearing those appeals and has a firsthand knowledge, not of every case, but certainly of cases that a CFP certificant may feel were not decided properly. Secondly, the board has a report at each in-person board meeting about a meaningful case that has come before the Disciplinary and Ethics Commission. So basically the facts and circumstances, how the DEC ruled on the case, if there were anything unusual, so the board's overseeing and hearing that. And finally, the board has had a thorough and complete report of the Disciplinary and Ethics Commission on an annual basis. So that's what the board has done. And as I said, the task force recommends expansion in that area, and that'll be part of what the organization takes up as it moves into the new year. Susan, next question. What is CFP Board's response to those who feel that the high priority placed on promoting the value of the CFP mark and increasing the number of CFP certificate holders is in direct conflict with its responsibility to serve the public by enforcing the requirements of CFP certification? I'll let you take that one.
Well, we don't see this as a conflict at all. The public benefits from both the growth in the number of CFP professionals and by enforcement of our requirements for certification. It's really in the public interest to have a greater numbers of competent and ethical financial planners available to serve more consumers. At the same time, we need to ensure that CFP professionals maintain the high ethical standards we demand of them. And as stated in our response to the task force recommendations, we're committed to strengthening our enforcement program.
Great. Thank you, Susan. This is kind of a similar question. It's one that we addressed earlier. Will you continue with the public awareness campaign in 2020? What is the budget? CFP Board's public awareness campaign is still very much in motion. The 2019 broadcasts have been completed as scheduled, and CFP Board is currently in the planning stages for 2020. To answer the specific question, what is the budget? It is about $12 million total. It's $145 for each CFP certificate that's dedicated for the direct cost of the CFP Board's public awareness campaign. Susan, somebody asked, did anything in the report surprise you?
Well, I think there are some surprises in the report for everyone. But the task force report is comprehensive and very robust, and the board has read it thoroughly. As I said, I've read it at least a dozen times myself. It echoes many of the important issues about CFP Board's enforcement program that were raised publicly over the summer, and the board has addressed through some enhancements that we outlined in our response. The report also highlighted a number of areas where CFP Board can make improvements to its governance structure, enterprise risk management system, and efforts to publicize the CFP mark. In response to this, we publicly declared 5 commitments that we believe directly address those areas. And many of these commitments that we had identified internally, separate from the task force report and recommendations, but we hadn't communicated them publicly.
Great. And Susan, we're coming to the end of the questions here. What additional resources, if any, will CFP Board be devoting to enforcement activities in the coming months?
Well, it's definitely going to be more. It's going to be more in terms of a larger portion of the budget. It's going to be more in terms of personnel. We're hoping that we can identify some software solutions that are going to make it a more efficient process. But, the board of directors is absolutely committed to getting this right. It's so important for the public to have faith in the CFP certificates. And it's so important to CFP certificates that we continue to be seen as trusted advisors. So, yes,
Susan,
the board is committed.
And Susan, I would, if you think about it, we just crossed the 86,000 number of CFP certificates this week. So 7,000, more than 7,000 people renew their CFP certification every month. And the background check on those, if you imagine what it takes to look at 7,000 backgrounds, since this summer we have had, right now we have 14 people, these are temporaries, but just to give you a sense of the scale, there are 14 people, 6 full-time attorneys, or 6 people working full-time who are attorneys, and 8 additional people looking at background checks. So this gives you a sense of the scale and the scope of the job. But as Susan, as you said, whatever it takes, it's important that we maintain the reputation of CFP certification.
Well,
Susan,
I just want to reiterate that how important it is for us as CFP certificates as well to make sure that we get this right. None of us want to have bad apples out there. The firms don't want to employ bad apples, and it just doesn't help anybody if we don't have a robust program. And so we are absolutely committed to this end.
Thank you, Susan. I have one final question here. It's come in several different ways. When are you going to have sample agreements or documents we can use to help us be in compliance with the new code and standards? And our staff team, Leo Rajeski, and working with Elizabeth Stewart, we've been working on guidance documents all along. So these sample agreements and documents are currently under construction, consistent with the recommendations of the task force. We will be testing those with members of the public to make sure that the disclosure agreements that we ultimately publish will be understandable with among the public whose benefit we exist to serve. Susan, before we go to closure, anything else you would have or add for this morning's presentation?
No, I just would like to reiterate that this is such an important effort for CFP Board, and that we really are committed for our certificates and for the benefit of the public.
Great. I would like to thank the CFP professional community for its support of CFP Board and the CFP certification. 2019 has been an important year for CFP certification with the October effective date of the new code and standards. We look forward to continuing our work to educate stakeholders about the new code and standards as we move toward the effective date of June 30th.
Well, and I hope everybody will take advantage of the great resources that are available on the new code and standards. Our new code and standards not only raises the bar further for CFP certification, but also the financial planning profession and the financial advice industry. Most importantly, it provides the public with the assurance that their CFP professional is trained, has been tested, and will do what's right for them. CFP Board is committed to helping CFP professionals and the profession understand and live into our new fiduciary promise to the public. As we share today, CFP Board is also committed to strengthening CFP Board's enforcement program for the code and standards. And as I wrap up my service on the Board of Directors, I am confident that the Board will continue to address the task force recommendations with careful deliberation.
Susan, thank you so much. I know with your cold you soldiered through. So one of the people here writes, please take care of yourself. We need you. So thank you, Susan, for your efforts and work on behalf of the CFP Board, CFP certification, and more broadly, the evolution of the financial planning profession. We all appreciate your leadership this year, and I thank everyone on the Board of Directors for their dedication to our mission. In closing, thank you all for joining us today. A recording of this presentation will be posted to CFP Board's website within the next week, and CFP Board will follow up individually with those who asked questions but we did not get to during this broadcast. Again, we thank you all, and we say happy holidays from CFP Board here in Washington. Have a great day, everybody.